Part 3 is back to biodiversity a little bit, and this more pronouncedly what we're going to deal with in the lab. This is trying to figure out what biodiversity actually means. And so, as I alluded to earlier, biodiversity of a community is basically trying to establish how many different kinds of organisms there are in that community. And when you investigate biodiversity the way most people think about it, you'll look at species richness. And when you talk about species richness, you simply count how many different species there are in that community. And you would have had to define your area where you're going to look. And then within that area, you simply count how many different kinds of organisms there are. Secondly, and this is also important, you would include not only how many different kinds of species there are, but you would also look at the relative abundance. And what that means is that in certain environments you find a large number of a single type of organism, and then that organism may actually be what defines that area. So if you think of a tropical rainforest, if you're looking for different types of organisms, one type of organism that defines a forest is obviously trees, right? And when you look at forests in various places, such as in a temperate forest versus a tropical rainforest, you may be looking at trees, and if you look at the number of trees, the different number of species of trees in a temperate forest, you probably find that there are fewer than there are in a tropical rainforest. In fact, in some of our forests, our temperate forests, if you think of evergreen forests, there may only be a single species or perhaps two species that define the entire forest. Whereas in a rainforest, you probably find dozens of different species of trees, and so the forest is very different. Not only because one is in a tropical environment, one is in a temperate environment, but also based on the relative abundance of certain species. Now, in this next diagram, it shows you examples for this. Now, if you look at simply the number of species, you would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 in both. The question is, what do you think would be more diverse? I mean, if you looked at woodland A, you can clearly see that there is one of these types of trees that's very abundant. And perhaps that is the tree species that defines the habitat. But when you look at woodland B, you realize that it's the same number of species, so just by looking at species, it doesn't necessarily give you a good idea of how diverse the habitat is, because in woodland B, the mixture is different. It's a lot more mixed, if you will. Now, they are equally diverse if you look only at species richness, but there is a difference in species diversity if you include abundance. Woodland A is defined by a single species, whereas woodland B is much more diverse. And so here is a way to look at this in a graph. You look at relative abundance now. There are only 4 species, but if you look at woodland B, they're equally abundant. There's about, there's an equal amount of each, 25% each. Whereas if you look at woodland A, there's clearly a difference. Now, this is to describe diversity. It doesn't mean one is good and one is bad. It's just to understand that when you're assessing diversity, there are various ways by which you can do it, and all of those are important if you're trying to get a really good estimate of what goes on in the habitat. Now, when we look at predation and species diversity in community, this is also very interesting and not at all obvious. It turns out that predator-prey relationships in some ways may define the diversity of species. So things aren't just by happenstance thrown together. There are actually intricate interactions between different kinds of organisms, and those interactions ultimately determine species diversity. It's not just that, oh, something migrated in by some means or other and there they are. No, if they persist, then they actually have to become part of some specific relationships. This gentleman here is Dr. Robert Payne, and one of the things he was interested in, this was already in the 1960s, he was simply trying to figure out what makes certain areas of the seashore diverse and others not so diverse. Because when you observe, for example, these woodlands, one of the questions you might ask is, how does woodland A become dominated by that one kind of tree? I mean, there's only so much chance can do. There must be some underlying mechanism why certain organisms are more successful than others. And so what he did is he removed a predator, and this was the novel approach. He removed the predator from an area of the rocky shore and didn't remove it from the area right nearby. So these were areas very close to each other, and in one, he literally had somebody go out, he himself or one of his students went out every day and took out the sea stars. That's what he did. And it turned out that the predator, even though the predator is consuming some of this diversity of life in that area, actually maintained species diversity, because the predator was taking away some of those organisms that would otherwise outcompete some of the others. And this was something that was totally new conceptually, that it could be the predator, which everybody thought is in a way damaging the diversity because predators are eating things, right? But this was not the case at all. The predator actually has a very important function, certain predators in an environment, in maintaining the diversity. And so this concept that resulted from this is called keystone predators. And so if you want a habitat to be diverse, the keystone predator needs to be there, whatever that keystone predator is. In some cases, we don't know until we try and figure it out experimentally. But this is a very interesting concept. So the sea star that goes around and eats all kinds of mussels and shellfish and clams and so on, if you take that away, and you may assume, the mussels and the shellfish, and they can now all be more diverse and everything, that's not true. Because as soon as you remove that predator, you lift the threat from some of these very important mussels, some of these important prey items, and in this case, the mussels will take over. So here's the example, the specific example in that particular area. He started his experiment in 1963, and in 1963 he began to look at two different plots, and from one he removed the predators, and if that happens, then the number of species drops. Look at that. There is 18 species present in that one plot, and it goes down to 2, I guess. This is probably 2. So from 18 down to 2, just because the sea star is removed. And the mussels are one of those. So the mussels are such strong competitors that way they will only allow one other kind of organism to coexist with them. And that's because on the edge of the sea, in this rocky environment, rocky shore environment, where there is water splashing and things are attached to rocks, there's only so much space, and all the organisms in that area basically need the same thing. They need nutrients, they need space to anchor themselves. But mussels will overgrow things. They will overgrow clams. They will overgrow everything else that's there, and they will occupy the space. But if you leave the sea star in, that's a very strong predator. They're voracious predators, and there's a lot of sea stars on the rocky seashore. You actually increase by a couple of species, increase the species diversity, because whenever the mussels are starting to become too numerous, the sea star will bring their numbers back down and therefore make space for other organisms. So the concept of the keystone predator was very illuminating, very instructive in trying to figure out diversity. Now, something else that affects diversity deeply is disturbances in a community. And disturbances are something that happens to a community in many different ways. There are minor disturbances and major disturbances. Some of these disturbances we're all familiar with. Flooding could be one. You could have fire, that could be another. You could have volcanic eruptions. Some of those are catastrophic and some of them less so. But you find that communities of organisms tend to have this built-in ability to recover. Now, it will change the diversity of that community once you take the community from a very diverse type back down to essentially nothing, and then you start filling it again. Then you might end up with a changed community, but nonetheless, there is always some way to get back to diversity. And that concept is called ecological succession. Ecological succession is remarkable. The Earth is very resilient when it comes to repopulating areas with organisms. Things always move around on the Earth. And it could be because wind, it could be because rain, it could be because of ocean currents sweep things into areas that for some reason have become devoid of life. Now, when there is an environment that is entirely dead, then you start with something called primary succession. There are examples of this. In the 1880s, there was a massive volcanic eruptions on an island called Krakatoa, and it basically killed off everything on the island because it's a cone volcano, and there was lava flowing down all the sides, eliminating everything in its path. That's it, dead, right? So since then, people have periodically come back to Krakatoa and figure out what's new, what the state of succession is. And people realized early on that even though the entire place looked like a moonscape, suddenly certain organisms, grasses at first, some shrubs second, then some insects, recolonized this island, and you had a classic case of primary succession. The same kind of thing applies to an island off the coast of Iceland that was formed by a volcano, a submarine volcano, and it pumped out a lot of lava, and that lava rose above the ocean. Of course, that's a classic example of how volcanoes can form land masses, and that island emerged in the 1970s. And once it emerged, it was large enough that it would stay emerged, it would stay above sea level, and people then every year literally used it as an ecological succession experiment to figure out what's next and what's next and what's next, and things ended up landing there and grasses grew and so on. So many of these observations are very interesting. If, on the other hand, the soil, for example, is left intact, and of course there's all kinds of organisms in the soil itself, perhaps as during clear cutting of the forest, then secondary succession can take place. And secondary succession is very interesting because one might wonder, what is the difference between primary and secondary succession? Well, obviously, with primary succession, there really isn't anything left. So you're starting from scratch and everything has to be imported. Whereas with secondary succession, some of what was there remains. And it may be that some root particles or some seeds remain, some of the microorganisms remain, and so you're getting some of the same than what you started with. So they are a little bit different. The entire environment looks wiped out. In one case, it's much more permanently wiped out than in the other, but it still has to regrow essentially from scratch. Now, when, for example, a glacier retreats, you have a barren landscape. And we're seeing this today because there are a lot of retreating glaciers today. So you can see this here. There is an example of the retreating glacier, still with a lot of snow and ice. And after the ice has totally receded, there's now a barren landscape. Now this, of course, has happened repeatedly because whenever there was an ice age, there were areas that had been covered by ice, and then the ice retreated. Well, in the process of covering everything by ice and freezing things over for several thousand years, you end up leaving basically nothing behind. At that point, primary succession is what you need. And so primary succession will begin in most areas that were glaciated at some point by having a moss and lichen stage. Moss and lichen are the first things that can come to an empty rocky area. And generally, when glaciers retreat, it's still a very cool environment, and so you'll find that those are the kinds of organisms that tend to find that area hospitable. Now, once you have mosses and lichens, you give the area a little bit of a topography. That means there's now things sticking out a tiny bit. Things are already growing, they stick out a tiny bit, and so therefore they can bring down some of the dust that would normally just get swept past the area. But now they're bringing it in. So you end up with soil deposition. You need to have some soil for plants to grow, and so that's one critical step. The next stage would be that grasses arrive, and grasses, of course, arrive on the wind, just like the soil would, and a few trees can arrive by the same means, and so you end up with landscapes that still have some of the lichens and the mosses. They have a thin layer of soil, and then there are a few trees that can grow. Now, of course, once a tree grows and sheds some foliage and sheds some bark, and there's all kinds of natural stuff being deposited on annual cycles, then you end up with a richer type of soil than before. And in particular, you'll find that from the alder and cottonwood as original colonizers, you now end up with spruce trees. And spruce is a very powerful colonizer. It is something that follows on in that stage. So you start with lichen, then you go to alder cottonwood, then you end up with spruce trees, and finally you end up with spruce and hemlock. So hemlock would be the next one. And you then lose most of the alder and cottonwood. So this whole primary succession sequence changes things out completely. And in most cases, this takes several hundred years. So that's not really that long, but it does take quite a bit of time. Now, when it comes to secondary succession, I just want to mention this. This is something that happens frequently when you have clear-cut forests, let's say in the tropics, but then they're left alone. You'll find that in some areas in Southeast Asia, you know that this was clear-cut because you can see photographs of perhaps some early exploitation of tropical hardwoods. You can see that from the 1920s and 1930s, and you look at it today and you see a forest. And you go into that forest and it looks like a really nice tropical rainforest to you. But what you don't realize is that there's been a switch. The tropical hardwoods are gone. But some of the trees that are growing relatively quickly that are not hardwoods, but they can still be quite diverse, now occupy the area and restore it. So with secondary succession, you don't necessarily get something that's really bad. You find something that looks like a pristine forest 80 years or so after it was clear cut. And you can see this in various areas that I've been in Malaysia, and it's remarkable. I mean, it really looks like a nice forest. The only way you can figure out that there is a difference is because the types of trees are different. So if you were to do a study, you look at data from the 1920s and 30s when people looked at what kinds of trees they found, and you do it now, you'll find that there is a significant difference between what you found then and what you find now. Has this affected the organisms that would live there? Clearly yes, because it's a different habitat. Has it been totally disruptive? Initially yes, but things can come back in because in most of these areas there was real rainforest left over, and so organisms simply come back and recolonize. So not all deforestation, as long as it's not permanent and as long as there is regrowth, not all of it is bad. It's just a shift sometimes. Now you will find some areas in Africa and South America and in Southeast Asia, where the rainforest that you walk through literally has been there in that same type of shape for 80 million years or so. That's basically how it is. The only thing that may have changed is, different kinds of organisms come and different kind of organisms go, but essentially it's the same. And then you walk next to it into a forest that's been around for maybe 80 years, and really the main difference is what kinds of trees you find. So it's really remarkable what can happen with succession. And that's the end of part 3.